Our last video covered the process for obtaining a French long-stay visa and all the requirements for paperwork to apply for that and get that done. So check out that previous video. It shows you the process for how to obtain that visa and therefore how to get more cruising time in your destination in the Mediterranean. We are at this point closing in on the handover date for our boat. We're really excited. It's going to be coming out of the Genoa factory in the interior of France in the late April timeframe. And from there it'll be trucked down to Cannes and Rousseau, where it will be commissioned and outfitted. And then that process will wrap up near the end of May, and we're looking at a handover date in that last week of May. So we're excited about that. The other element to this is our shipment of all of our boat gear that left the United States about 2 months ago. So as we discussed in the previous video, we put that shipment on a container ship, and that left the US West Coast. And I was tracking the shipment closely as it went across the Atlantic, and then it went through several ports around the English Channel and finally ended up in Rotterdam about a week ago. So right now we're waiting for customs clearance on that shipment, and then once that happens it'll be trucked down to Cannes and Rousseau for inclusion in the construction of the boat. So those are the two pieces that are in process now. The shipment actually took a little bit longer than we expected, a couple weeks later for its arrival in Rotterdam, but we're hopeful that things will still go smoothly and it'll get down to the boat in time to be included in all the construction. So our next major milestone is dealing with and obtaining boat insurance and other related pieces of documentation needed for cruising overseas. So that's what this video is going to be about. We'll get started right in with boat insurance. Okay, so for boat insurance, if you're a boat owner, you're already, I'm sure, familiar with the process of getting insurance in your local country. For instance, in the US, you can get insurance through a number of carriers. A lot of the auto insurance companies will also cover you, or homeowners insurance companies will cover you for a boat insurance policy. And a lot of the boater organizations like Boat US have great plans for covering you for boating in domestic waters. That situation is very different if you're going to be going overseas. When we traveled to the Caribbean on our previous boat, our boat insurance company would not insure us. We had to get a policy through a different carrier. So keep that in mind. Do check with your policy or your insurance company, and likely you'll find out that you'll have to get a new policy for your new cruising area. The first thing is you want to get multiple quotes. Like anything else, you're going to want to talk to multiple agents. I would recommend you start with independent insurance agents. They're going to go out and search many different carriers to look at the best carrier for coverage in the area you're going to and for your type of boat and all that. So they're really, I think, your best bet, and they're going to shop for your best deal. So definitely talk to several agents, get multiple quotes, and that'll be in your best interest for coverage. If you're going to be sailing in the Med like we're doing, one thing to keep in mind is you're going to want to make sure you get your insurance certificate translated into multiple languages. This is particularly the case, as we understand it, for Spain, Italy, and Greece. And certainly if your insurance carrier provides other language translations, I would take as many as you can get. So this makes the process for when you clear into a country, or if you check in a marina, it makes the process a lot easier if they have the insurance certificate in their local language. Further, you should be prepared for when looking at the liability levels for your insurance. Be prepared for certain countries to have certain higher limits for liability. For instance, our policy that we ended up obtaining was for a $1 million US dollar liability level. However, and Italy is the main country in the Mediterranean where you have to be concerned about this. Italy has laws that require you to have at least a minimum of €5 million liability level, or about $6 million US dollars. So if you arrive in the country and, for instance, go into a marina to stay in in a slip there, they're going to require to see your insurance certificate, and they're going to look for that liability level. If you don't have that liability level for Italy, you'll be required to take out a separate policy with a local Italian insurance agent, and obviously you're going to be paying extra money and all that. So if you're talking to a good agent, they should know about these situations and they should be taking care of it for you. We were fortunate the agent we went through produced all the local language certificates, and through our normal policy, they provided the $6 million US Italian certificate for us as part of our normal policy. So that was very smooth there, but do keep that in mind. Be sure to look at the navigation limits and boundaries on your policy, and be very clear with your agent where you're intending to cruise. And obviously if there's some optional areas you're thinking about, make sure you include those so you don't have to go back and modify your policy later. And once you get your policy sent to you or a draft of it, be sure to read through closely to make sure that they covered your navigation areas properly. I told them the areas within the Mediterranean that we were going to be sailing in, and a lot of companies came back with latitude and longitude boundaries, so I had to jump on Google Maps and make sure that, the countries we're intending to go to were within those latitude and longitude boundaries. And in general, just make sure that you read through your policy very closely. There's going to be restrictions on named storms and hurricanes and those kind of things, possibly other exclusions, and you want to read those very, very closely. Some carriers are going to look for a certain level of past experience and understand what your sailing experience is, either on the boat you have or on previous boats of that size or slightly smaller. So you want to be prepared. If you can prepare an actual sailing resume, that makes it even easier with them. And if you have any kind of evidence of competency or licensing for boating, that's going to be in your favor to share that with your agent. In the U.S., for instance, there's a U.S. Coast Guard captain's license, which I have one. And through other countries, like from the UK, there's the Royal Yachting Association. I think it's called their Boatmaster license. Any of those kind of things that you have, then it'll make it easier for you to get insured. There's also something called the ICC, International Certificate of Competency. It was created by the UN to establish kind of a standard for competency for boating. Unfortunately, the United States did not sign that. So you can't kind of easily get an ICC license. For me or for other U.S. citizens, you'd have to go overseas to get, for instance, to the UK to go through a program there to get an ICC. So I'm kind of hoping that my captain's license will be sufficient. The rumor is that there's certain countries in the Mediterranean that are sticklers about this. They want to see that ICC certificate. Croatia is one of them that apparently there's some rumblings about. Sometimes cruisers have been stuck having to go through a local boating license course in order to be allowed into the country. So that's something to consider. Whatever you have, even if it's a boater safety course or navigation course, anything like that that can show your educational background related to boating and your practical experience. Again, that sailing resume will be especially helpful, documenting the boats that you've owned or sailed or crewed on, and how long you have been on those boats, what size of boats they are, and where you've navigated with those boats, and your role on the boat. All that kind of stuff would be helpful in your resume. So, in addition to liability, you're going to have an agreed value amount on your policy, and for a new boat like ours, I gave them our purchase agreement for the boat, so it was pretty easy to justify the agreed to value. If your boat is older, you're going to more than likely be required to have a survey done, and then the value of that survey is going to be integrated into something close to the agreed to value. You may still have some wiggle room to negotiate that agreed to value, but be very careful to give what you feel is the most accurate amount of what that boat is worth currently on the market. If you give a higher number, the risk is you're going to be spending more money for insurance coverage and not get money back if you have a total loss. Because they're still going to look at what's the replacement value or the true value of that boat, not what you establish as your agreed-to value. If you come in and lowball the amount and say you've got a $100,000 boat and you say an agreed-to value of $50,000, so that maybe you don't have to pay quite as much insurance premium on, that's also risky, because if you have an accident that damages the boat that's up to or close to $50,000, the insurance company is going to claim that as a total loss on the boat, and you'll get $50,000 back, but you'll have had a boat worth $100,000 that will disappear. It'll be taken over by the insurance company. So it's almost like you're agreeing to a trade-in value if you think about it that way. So be sure that you pick that value that's as close to the actual true value of the boat, including any kind of upgrades and additional things you added to the boat. So in the U.S., some of the agents you might want to talk to for coverage globally are Jack Martin and Associates. They're actually the ones that we went forward with. They're in Annapolis. Pentaneous, which has several offices in Europe and in the U.S. There's a company called Jackline and IMIS, which stands for International Marine Insurance Services. You might check with them. They do a lot of advertising in magazines. Another company I talked to was Offshore Risk Management. There's another company called the Pegasus Group in Florida. And also I sort of went overseas and I tried this company called Topsail Insurance in the UK, just to kind of see how that might compare by going with a company that was not based or did not have an office in the US. So those are some companies you might try as a first stab, but do make sure you get multiple quotes. In the end, you may discover that the actual carrier behind the policy is going to be Lloyd's of London. They're a major carrier for boating insurance. And so, if you do get them as your carrier, you can feel relatively secure that because they're a pretty strong insurance carrier for you. So that's boating insurance. Okay, I'm next going to talk to you about healthcare related insurance. So the first thing to think about is medical evacuation insurance. This actually may be required and not optional for you if you're getting one of the long stay visas like from France. Then they typically require you to have some kind of evac insurance and repatriation insurance. So one of the major companies in this area is called Dan Boater. Dan stands for Diver Alert Network. You don't have to be a diver to get their policies, but they're a prominent company that's been doing this for a long time, and actually they're the company that we went with. So Dan Boater, you can go on their website, and it's actually quite reasonable to get evacuation insurance, and also evacuation and repatriation. So if there's an emergency and you need to be evacuated, they'll fly you out to where there's competent medical care, and repatriation is if you die, it's repatriation of your remains. So think about that as a starting point. Also, take a look at your existing healthcare insurance. Likely, you will not be covered overseas, or it'll be a very limited amount of coverage. For our healthcare insurance, when I read the fine print, and then I actually had to call them as well to confirm this, but we're only covered for emergency room visits overseas. So if we have some other, injury or something like that doesn't necessitate going to an emergency room, or an illness or something like that, that's going to be out of pocket for us. So you want to do that research to understand what you're at least covered for with your existing healthcare insurance. My understanding is there are some healthcare insurance plans that you can get in Europe that are actually quite reasonable. So look into that. I don't have any names of them, but I've just heard that through some of the forums that I've participated in. So that's something to consider there. And lastly, getting back to the Dan Boater organization, Dan Boater also has a travel insurance, cancellation insurance, and all that. That's kind of an augmentation to their evacuation insurance. So if you're looking, or if that's of interest to you, or think it might be worth it to have some sort of travel accident insurance, a change of flight kind of insurance, you might look at them as well. There's a whole bunch of companies that do those kind of insurance policies, but I was actually pretty impressed with what the Dan Boater organization had for that. So that's healthcare insurance. Okay, so let's move off the topic of insurance, and I wanted to start going through the U.S. Coast Guard documentation process with you. Obviously, this is targeted towards those in the U.S. U.S. boat owners. If you own a boat in the United States, you're going to be going overseas. While you can, if your boat is registered in your state, some countries will accept that state boater registration. I highly recommend that you apply for the U.S. Coast Guard Certificate of Documentation. This is an internationally recognized document, and it is kind of the standard for clearing into customs if you're a U.S. boater. So if you bought your boat used, you typically there might be a certificate of documentation already in place, and you can apply to make a change to that document. You apply through what's called the National Vessel Documentation Center. They have a website. You can start this online or send in your information by mail. So again, National Vessel Documentation Center outside of Washington, D.C. It's in Virginia. For us, with purchasing a new boat, we were required to obtain obviously a new certificate of documentation. Nothing had been documented beforehand. And after I talked to them on the phone for a while to understand the process, there's a couple steps that we could go through that we can kind of get the process started. And the reason this is important is that when you get a certificate of documentation, you get a document number. And that document number is helpful for applying for other things, as I'll mention here in a minute, radio licenses and other stuff. You don't want to have to wait till you got all your paperwork in order to apply for the certificate of documentation to get that number. You want to get those other things started ahead of time. So there was kind of a stepwise process I went through. And the first thing you need to do in order to get that document number from the National Vessel Documentation Center is to get your hull number from your boat. So again, if you're buying a new boat, be in front of your broker and the manufacturer and try to get that hull number as soon as possible. We were able to get a hull number about a month before the boat was completed. And so you can start that process by filling out you'll see it on the website. It's the 1258 form for applying for a new certificate of documentation. You can fill out as much information as you can, including your hull number, and let them know that the rest of the information will be coming after that, and they will get back to you. They actually emailed me with the document number. So that's the first step. What happens with that document number is that now you can apply for a radio call sign for the boat, a VHF radio call sign. You need that document number in order to do that. So you go on the FCC website and you apply for a pleasure boat, or it's called an SA or SB type of license. And that allows you to use your VHF radio, and it gives you your call sign for that. Costs a couple $100 to apply for that. They're usually very quick. They got back to me the next day on it's also called a ship station license, but a lot of people just call it a VHF call sign license. So again, you'll need your U.S. Coast Guard document number for that. And once you have that process started, you can actually, during the FCC licensing process, you can request what's called an MMSI, Maritime Mobile Service Identity. So a mouthful there. But that number is very important for you to have to set up your VHF radio. Usually all the VHF radios now have DSC, or digital selective calling, and you need that MMSI. It's kind of a unique identifier with radio communications for your boat. So again, you'll need that for your VHF radio. If you're using AIS, like on your chart plotter or iPad, you'll need to enter your MMSI number in there to again uniquely identify your boat when transmitting to other boats. So that MMSI number you can get from applying for your VHF call sign through the FCC website. So a couple steps involved in there. So that's the starting of the process, getting back to the certificate of documentation with the Coast Guard. Now, to actually get your physical paper that you'll need to clear in through customs, the actual certificate, you'll need two more things, what's called an MSO and a BC. The MSO is the manufacturer's statement of origin, and the BC is called the builder's certificate. These are standard forms that any boat manufacturer will have, and they'll provide to you when you purchase your boat. You'll need those to give to the Coast Guard to have that initial certificate of documentation. Again, this doesn't apply if you purchased a boat that already had documentation number with it. I think all you need to apply or give in that case is your bill of sale and pay a fee and all that good stuff. So a couple steps there for your MSO and BC. Once you provide that to the U.S. Coast Guard as an addendum to your original application with the hull number, is to that will then generate the actual certificate of documentation. So you get that physical piece of paper in the mail, which again is what you physically need to provide to a customs agent to clear into a country. So a little bit of stepping here and there and back and forth, but it's a very important process. You'll definitely need that certificate of documentation in order to clear into a country. Lastly, once you have your documentation number, and again, I'm assuming this is a new boat we're talking about, you'll need to affix a plaque or a marker on your boat somewhere permanent with that number on it. The Coast Guard requires at least a 3-inch high lettering on that. So on our boat, we just took a wood plaque and I carved out the number on there, and that's going to be permanently fixed to an area in the bilge. So probably not an item that will be inspected by a foreign country, but when you have a survey done, the surveyor is going to look for that number to make sure that it uniquely identifies your boat, and to make sure that the survey links up with the boat name and all that kind of stuff. So that's the U.S. Coast Guard documentation process. Okay, a couple other licenses that you want to keep in mind and apply for if you don't already have them. I mentioned earlier about the competency licenses like a Coast Guard captain's license or the ICC. So if you have those, definitely use those for your insurance, but also carry them with you. They're very helpful to show when you're checking in to a new country. The next one is radio licenses, and I touched on this previously, but you'll need a license for your VHF radio. This is, I believe, optional in the United States, but is often required in other countries, although I understand that it's not always checked or rarely checked, but you don't want to have this be the one thing that limits you or gets the Coast Guard pissed off at you. So you want to apply with the FCC to get that VHF Call Sign license. Sometimes called a ship station license. And again, that will give you your MMSI number to put into your AIS systems and man overboard beacons and all that good stuff. If you have a single sideband radio, there'll be a separate call sign associated with that. You can again apply for that, and you will need to apply for that through the FCC website to get that. It's also called an amateur radio license. You might want to consider getting a ham license while you're at it. That's what I have, and I went through a course to get a ham license. This gives you access to additional channel or frequencies on your single sideband radio. And again, this is all licensed through the FCC website. If you're carrying pets on board, you'll definitely need a rabies certificate, and you actually I would recommend you read up on the Noon site website. They have some good information there on what to do if you're bringing pets into another country. I know for one thing that if you get a rabies certificate in the United States, it may not be recognized and approved in Europe. They are going to require you to have a certificate from an EU country or EU veterinarian. So keep that in mind. Also, if you have a drone, if you're flying a drone, I would recommend you get the FCC license. It's currently voluntary in the United States, but it does show a certain amount of formality and willingness to oblige regulations in your home country. And then when you're overseas, I would definitely try to read up about what the laws are about drone usage. You may not find a lot written, or maybe not clear about what the laws are, and I would just suggest that you be cautious and respectful of not flying too close to other people or houses or anything like that, and so that you don't get the rest of us in trouble when we come with our drones. And lastly, I'll cover just a couple of random topics that are kind of related to the overall insurance and documentation stuff. If you're going to be renting a car overseas, you may want to consider an international driver's license. For us, we got one very quickly just by going into the AAA office. And chances are you'll be able to use your U.S. driver's license, but it's not a bad idea, and it doesn't take a lot of effort to get your international driver's license. You also want to be carrying on board copies of your passports in case the passports get lost or stolen. You can always take those into a U.S. embassy or consulate, and it just makes the process easier. I would suggest carrying copies of birth certificates for anybody who's going to be on board. That shows another way to show their nationality and their age. You may want to carry a marriage certificate. We actually needed a marriage certificate to apply for the long stay visa, so I just threw one into our pile of papers that we have on board. If you have any certificate of origin or manufacturer registration information for your dinghy and outboard, you might want to include that as well in your stack of papers. So speaking of stack of papers, I would recommend you put all this stuff into a binder. We have a 3-ring binder on the boat that I carry ashore when we go into clearing the customs, and it has everything there all together in protective plastic sheets. So if it gets a little wet, it can handle it. I've heard other cruisers use like this Tupperware covers that clasp and make a watertight seal. And that actually sounds great, particularly if you have to abandon your boat in a hurry. You want to be able to grab your paperwork and have it with you. Or if you're going ashore in rough weather, it's going to keep all your documents dry. So those are some considerations for you. And lastly, I'd recommend that you get a boat card. Boat card's sort of like a business card you might have for your job with a company. But it's has your name and your boat name on there, and any other contact information you want to have, emails or web addresses or whatever. So if you haven't cruised a lot, you'll discover that boat cards are actually pretty cool. It's an easy way for you to give your contact information to another boater, and you'll be receiving boat cards as well from other people, and you can always kind of jot a little note down on the card to help you remember who that person was. You'll find that you may actually run into people quite more often than you expected to. You might meet somebody in Anchorage and then you leave, and all of a sudden another week later you run into them again. So having those boat cards is helpful so you can remember who they are, and obviously if you want to stay in touch with somebody, give your boat card out so that they can see and know how to contact you. So that wraps up the video. I appreciate any comments you might have, and we're always looking for feedback either on our YouTube channel or on our blog, www.life4.0.com. And thank you very much. Hope you have a good day.